Thank you so much for this program. And I just want to remind you that Akil Reed-Amar will be signing books this evening. He will also be back with us on Thursday, April 28th for another great program, From John Jay to the Roberts Court. So stay for the book signing, and we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much.
You're watching American History TV, all weekend, every weekend on C-SPAN 3. To join the conversation, like us on Facebook at C-SPAN History.
Every week leading up to the 2016 elections, Road to the White House Rewind brings you archival coverage of presidential races. Next, a U.S. Information Agency film on the 1968 campaign. Titled A Private Decision, it chronicles the race from the first primaries in New Hampshire to the surprise withdrawal of President Lyndon Johnson from the race, through Robert Kennedy's assassination and the national political conventions, to Richard Nixon's victory over Hubert Humphrey in the general election. During the Cold War, the U.S. Information Agency made films for international audiences to promote American society and democracy, and by law, they couldn't be shown in the U.S. until 12 years after they were produced. This half-hour film is courtesy of the National Archives.
The political situation here in New Hampshire. The rest of the country is still watching us.
Once every 4 years, when the United States turns its attention to choosing a leader, a small, snowy state in the northeastern corner of the country becomes the political center of the nation.
It will show the other states that New Hampshire clearly wants Richard Nixon to be the next president of the United States.
The final campaigning is underway in the New Hampshire presidential primary coming up next Tuesday. On the Republican side, Richard Nixon is urging New Hampshire Republicans to give him a big send-off in his quest for the GOP presidential nomination.
New Hampshire signals the start of the national presidential campaign by holding the first primary election of the year. So the men who then wanted to be president, Richard Nixon, Michigan's Governor George Romney, and Senator Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota, drew national attention to New Hampshire as they started the campaign with ritual treks through the snow, hoping these visits would bring them victory in this first voter test, where one man from each political party would win the state's support at the political conventions in the summer. Laconia is a small town in New Hampshire. The most popular pastime in winter is dog sled racing. Problems that concern other parts of the country may seem far away, but behind its placid landscape and its comfortable homes, Laconia's people were aware of the challenges their country faced in this election year, and many became actively involved in the primary campaign. Jim Wilson lives in Laconia. Like many of his neighbors, he is a member of the Republican Party. This year, he is chairman of the Laconia Chamber of Commerce, and he owns the town's camera store.
If you're familiar with Super 8 cameras, Ed, this is the one that loads with a drop-in cartridge.
Jim cares deeply about the future of his country, and he is concerned about the way the government spends money, including his tax money. He thinks the Republican administration can do a better job, and Jim thinks there is one man who can do it best. Jim is a Nixon man.
There's absolutely no advantage for Nixon to come and debate because
That's right.
as long as Nixon stays in the background, says nothing, Romney just digs a deeper hole and buries himself. So the Nixon, when he comes out, he's right on top.
With Romney right now is that...
But his wife, Anne, is still considering other candidates.
If Rockefeller were going to run, I'd vote for him because I think he's that middle-of-the-road candidate that we need.
But would you consider voting for Eugene McCarthy?
Well, that's, all right, so that's beside the point. We know he's not going to make it.
There were others in Laconia who did not share Anne's pessimistic appraisal of Senator McCarthy. One was Ron O'Callaghan. Like Jim, Ron is a businessman. He runs a family-owned electronics firm. He is a member of the Democratic Party. In 1964, Ron had voted for President Johnson. But this year, deeply disturbed by the war in Vietnam, he had decided to work for the election of Senator Eugene McCarthy.
Clearly, though, our point...
McCarthy was opposed to the course of the war and had challenged the president for the Democratic nomination.
But the war has taken so much money out of the economy, taken so much, the war on poverty, what Johnson called the Great Society, so much punch has been taken out of what he tried to do because of the war that it's become a mockery.
Oh, well, put somebody else in if you think he's wrong.
All right, we'll do that.
All right.
2 boys. 6
The Laconia Chamber of Commerce sponsored a series of breakfasts for all the candidates, and Ron and Jim and their wives, Ann and Dottie, attended them all. And Ron got his first close look at the man he wanted to see win.
Well, as I see the campaign in '68, the issue of Vietnam itself is a vital one, of course, and you could pass a harsh judgment on that war if it were isolated altogether from any domestic consequences or any other international consequences. But underneath all of this, I think, is a fundamental judgment that we're called upon to make as to what the real role of America is, to what direction do we want to give to America, what influence do we want it to have on the rest of the world. And I see this is the fundamental test that we have to face up to in the electoral process of the year 1968.
Richard Nixon came to town a few days later, and Jim had a chance to meet and talk with the man who was his personal choice for the presidency. Nixon had the most practical experience of all the candidates.
Are these for nothing?
As vice president in the Eisenhower administration, he had been actively involved in running the country for 8 years.
Yeah, they'll take one of everything I get.
Nixon was a man that Republicans had always been able to count on. He attended thousands of dinners and rallies to help the Republican cause. The people he helped remembered and appreciated his work. And it was this personal contact with thousands of ordinary Americans that was to become the backbone of the Nixon campaign.
It was my pleasure to have Mr. Nixon here as our speaker when I came into office this past year.
I know he mentioned being here, and I just met your wife. And right. Boy, you're really strogged up, aren't you?
Well, you know, we have to really promote sled dogging and all our winter events around here.
Jim was pleased to have Nixon as his guest at the World Championship dog sled races.
We're doing about an hour and 10 minutes.
Terrific.
Yeah, you're doing an hour and 8.
Well, anyway.
Now, I've seen it in Alaska, and I've seen it in Laconia. Good. Well, it's a pleasure to have you here again today.
Good to see you.
Right. Yeah. And you have my vote, so I want you to know that it's...
What's that?
I mean that.
Jim had promised Nixon his vote, and he went to work to fulfill that promise by working for the Nixon campaign in Laconia.
Don't we have any other choice, Jim?
Well, there are quite a few choices. Are you a true Johnson Democrat?
All the way. I think that he's handling the things as well as they can be handled.
Ward 7, 467.
Right.
The Democrats who were supporting the president had organized an intensive write-in campaign, urging voters to endorse the administration by writing President Johnson's name on the Democratic ballot. In effect, asking him to run again.
I would say we've got some work that has to be done on Election Day to better this.
And be sure that you write in the name of President Johnson.
Senator McCarthy was a newcomer to presidential politics. And since many Democrats were supporting the president, Ron and Dottie began work on the McCarthy campaign with few assets. There was little popular support for the senator, a sparse organization, and even less money. Every vote was important.
Well, we're glad you stopped in this morning. We're glad you stopped in this morning. Send some more of your friends in for the shuttle bus.
The McCarthy campaign did have one great asset: young people, many of them students too young to vote. They flocked to New Hampshire to support the senator's cause.
Okay, bring back 80 shell used.
At first, it was called the Children's Crusade, and no one thought they could compete with the professionals in the hard work of organizing a presidential campaign. But leaders of both political parties were to describe this sudden involvement by thousands of young people in the political process as one of the most important benefits of the election year.
Well, we'd like to give you some literature. Hopefully we could get a good vote. Oh, he's a good candidate, I think. I enjoy
Senator McCarthy also got some support from another unorthodox source. Actors and actresses lent some of their glamour to the cause, and Paul Newman became the political box office smash of Laconia.
If you have areas where you feel your own rumblings and your own dissension and your own questioning, then I think it's necessary to get behind the senator now, early in the game, and not sit around and wait till you feel that you're ready to make a political commitment that's convenient to you.
A few weeks before primary day, the Republican race lost a challenger. George Romney withdrew.
The CBS News poll of Republicans in New Hampshire last night shows that George Romney's withdrawal has helped Richard Nixon as much as Nelson Rockefeller. Of the Romney supporters who now say they will vote for another candidate, about half favor Nixon and half favor Rockefeller.
People like you might write Rockefeller's name in, because you're...
Some people, including Ann Wilson, thought Governor Nelson Rockefeller might take Romney's place.
Felt about Romney as they did.
And I will vote for any Republican candidate that wins in Miami at the convention.
Nixon,
and it'll either be Nixon or Rockefeller.
But no one could really compete with Richard Nixon in New Hampshire.
Oh, there he is.
By the time Nixon made his last campaign speech, he had most of the state's Republican votes, and according to all predictions, he was already a winner.
I say to you, having traveled through this state, having met hundreds of you personally and thousands of you that I've spoken to, having heard your questions, having looked into your faces, you have given me new hope about America. Is New Hampshire going to indicate, this bellwether state, that a change is going to come in November, or is it going to be more of the same? And I say to you, turn out. Let's get the biggest vote we've ever had. And with that vote, you not only will see to it that we will win tomorrow, but that New Hampshire will vote for new leadership in November, and America will get a new president in January. Thank you.
Primary day in New Hampshire was quiet, a sharp contrast to the intensity of the campaigns.
Hi, you ready to go down and vote? I've got Bunny to watch the store right now, and it seems like a good time. We can get there while there aren't too many crowds or anything.
But each voter went to the polls with the obligation to make his choice in this first test as carefully as he would in November. The voting procedure was simple.
Wilson, James R.
Republican or Democrat?
Republican.
Registered voters received their party's ballot.
Dorothy O'Callahan, Democrat.
Claire Livingston.
Moved to a booth to mark it in private, returned it to a sealed ballot box, and had their names recorded to prevent voter fraud.
James R. Wilson.
James R. Wilson.
Ron and Dottie voted for McCarthy, but they also had a personal interest in this election. Ron was on the ballot as a McCarthy delegate. If elected, he would go to Chicago in August to vote for the senator as a representative of his state. The polls would close at 6 o'clock, but until then, campaign workers for all the candidates were busy, urging their neighbors to vote.
This morning?
No, I'm going to Gilmanton, but not for him.
Have you voted yet in the primaries for president?
No, sir, but that's my boy right there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, this is Mrs. Kirby at Nixon headquarters. We wanted to be sure and remind you to vote today, and we'd be glad to provide
At Nixon headquarters, voters were offered rides to the polls, a common practice in both political parties. It began to snow in Laconia, but that did not stop the voters from going to the polls. It looked so easy. A mark on a piece of paper, a name written in. It was as simple as picking out a new hat or selecting fresh vegetables for dinner. And it was done as casually. But in each voter's mind, there was the feeling that his vote, his personal choice of a presidential candidate, could make a difference.
Mr. Clark, I now declare the polls closed.
While Ron went to McCarthy headquarters in Manchester, Dottie stayed in Laconia. And she was finding it hard to wait for the final vote count.
316. McCarthy quite strong with over 50% of the vote.
At this point, President Johnson has 288 votes, Senator Bunting has 300.
It was an upset. McCarthy made a surprisingly strong showing, and young people who had worked for him suddenly had proof that they could influence a national election by working for change within the framework of the democratic process. Ron was amazed and delighted when he found out he had scored a personal upset victory and had been elected as a delegate. Dottie, of course, was thrilled. Jim and Ann stayed home on primary night with their children to celebrate Nixon's overwhelming victory in the Republican race. And they were convinced that their candidate would win more victories in the future. As the campaign moved out of New Hampshire and into other states, Ron traveled to nearby Vermont to work for McCarthy at that state's Democratic Convention, which was held instead of a primary to pick the state's delegates and presidential choices. And now McCarthy was facing competition from a new candidate. Senator Robert Kennedy had decided to run.
With the decisions that are made by this convention today,
there were other unexpected events.
With our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not...
Jim and Ann did not realize at first, as they listened to the president's speech, that he was about to tell the nation he would not run for the presidency again.
Partisan causes. Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Vice President of the United States.
Well, thank you.
And Vice President Humphrey became the last major Democratic candidate to enter the race. As heir to the support that had been given to the president, Humphrey acquired a substantial number of delegate votes before the National Convention.
Thank you very much. Bill Ward. Bill? Yes, sir. Thank you. Hello there.
Senator Robert Kennedy ended most of his campaign speeches with the phrase, Some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not. Before those dreams could ever become reality, Senator Kennedy was killed, shot by an assassin in the kitchen of a Los Angeles hotel. The nation mourned, and for a time politics were forgotten. Although the country had lost a man that many loved, his death could not destroy the essential stability of the democratic process. The nation still had to choose a leader, and in time the campaigns began again.
Could we have a Nixon poster?
Oh, you mean for class?
Yes.
Jim Wilson, working for Nixon in Laconia, was looking forward to the Republican National Convention.
Okay, well, I'll handle it.
The choices at the Miami Beach Convention were Richard Nixon,
Well, great. Aren't you having fun now, huh?
Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, who was now working hard for the nomination, and California's Governor, Ronald Reagan. As the Republican delegates gathered in this resort city, it soon became clear that Nixon was also their choice by an overwhelming mandate.
The next President of the United States, Richard Nixon.
Tonight, I again proudly accept that nomination for President of the United States. Tonight, I see the face of a child. He lives in a great city. He's black or he's white. He's Mexican, Italian, Polish. None of that matters. What matters, he's an American child. He sleeps the sleep of childhood, and he dreams the dreams of a child. That child in that great city is more important than any politician's promise. He is America. I see another child tonight. He hears the train go by at night, and he dreams of faraway places where he'd like to go. Seems like an impossible dream. But he is helped on his journey through life. A father who had to go to work before he finished the 6th grade sacrificed everything he had so that his sons could go to college. And tonight, he stands before you, nominated for President of the United States of America.
Nixon selected Maryland's Governor Spiro Agnew as his running mate for the office of Vice President. It was now time for the Democratic Convention, and McCarthy and Vice President Humphrey were the leaders in the Democratic race. Ron and Dottie went to Chicago as part of the New Hampshire delegation. There, they continued their protest, along with many other delegates, who also wanted to see a more detailed plan for peace as the party's campaign theme. Other demonstrators protested against the war in the city's streets. And these protests erupted into a confrontation with police that drew the concerned attention of many Americans. The delegates shared that concern, but first they had to fulfill their obligation to nominate a Democrat for the presidency. As the balloting went on, it became clear that Vice President Humphrey had the support of the convention. But Ron and most of the New Hampshire delegates were pledged to vote for McCarthy, and they honored that pledge.
Cast 20 votes for Senator Eugene J. McCarthy and 6 votes for Vice President Humphrey.
And Vice President Humphrey won the nomination. Ron and Dottie went back to Laconia and talked about the convention with their friends.
It is the very differences of individuals, individual groups and everything else that save this whole damn thing for us. If we all thought the same, we wouldn't really be free. Because if you believe in democracy, you believe that two things, ration and reason. The other thing is you realize that all people don't look at what is right for a human society the same way. It's a matter of degree. So somehow you have to talk them. And in politics, you never get 100%. If you get 80%, you'll probably end up with 60% of what you really want. For the guy you work the hardest for.
It is never easy to accept defeat, but Ron endorsed the decision in Chicago and supported the Democratic nominee, realizing that Humphrey had been nominated by the will of the majority. And before long, a large Humphrey poster appeared on the side of Ron's house. As the campaign moved into its final weeks, the nation considered its choices. Vice President Humphrey,
Let me stand it to you down here.
George Wallace, the former governor of Alabama, representing a third-party movement, and Richard Nixon. Campaigns are always flamboyant, and as the candidates moved across the country, they were surrounded by all the traditional vote-getting glitter.
Massachusetts, good. Good to see you. Hi. Your daughter here? Yep. I hope you got her in it. I hope.
But there was a serious purpose behind the bands and balloons. Each candidate was meeting the people, giving them a chance to evaluate his thoughts as a potential president and to look closely at him as a man. Laconia's people, in the fall, are part of one of nature's most impressive pageants. As the leaves turn and the ducks drop in briefly on their way to the south, the countryside signals the end of a season with a stillness and grandeur interrupted only by the sounds of children returning to school. The people of the United States went to the polls to elect their president, confronted by a decision that could hold the key to the nation's future place in the world. But they knew that whomever the new president would be, he would receive the support of the entire nation as he was given the awesome responsibility of leading the country.
How different from that morning 8 years ago.
And in this election year, the nation chose Richard Nixon, bringing to its final conclusion a democratic process that had started months before in New Hampshire.
I received a very gracious message from the Vice President. I know exactly how he felt. Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun.
Really very exciting. You made a great speech.
It was very,
You'll be on
very
TV again
close.
tonight, I'm sure, and you'll be able to watch it.
A kid yelled out when we came in from lunch recess, Nixon won, and everybody said, they looked around and everything. Were they happy? Yeah, they were. Well, I'm really glad that I voted for Nixon because I believe that he can really get things started again. It all boils down to the fact that the country wanted a clean sweep, and this is what Nixon is going to do. He's going to get in a whole new bunch of people who will have a different outlook on things, and this is what we needed.
It's just overwhelming. I've never been so pleased at a political outcome.
Naturally, as a Democrat, I'm unhappy that he won, but in a sense, I think there's a certain amount of justice there. I think that what the American people have done, have told Nixon, have told Johnson, Humphrey, anybody who might be president now or in the future, that they're accountable for their actions. They're accountable for their policy.
You're watching American History TV, all weekend, every weekend on C-SPAN 3. To join the conversation, like us on Facebook at C-SPAN History.
This past Tuesday, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger defended his role in the Vietnam War to a gathering of policymakers, Vietnamese, veterans, and war protesters. Some 40 years after the fall of Saigon and America's withdrawal from Vietnam, he called the 1975 evacuation one of the saddest moments of his life, but insisted he had no regrets. Kissinger sat down with LBJ Presidential Library Director Mark Updegrove on the first of a three-day conference in Austin, Texas, that organizers called the Vietnam War Summit, then took questions from the audience. We'll hear first from several introductory speakers, including President Johnson's two daughters, Lyndon Johnson Robb and Lucy Baines Johnson. The conversation with Kissinger starts in about 30 minutes. This program is 2 hours.
Please welcome Mr. David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, Mrs. Lyndon Johnson Robb, daughter of Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson, the Honorable Hubert Vo, member of the Texas House of Representatives and Vietnam immigrant, Miss Lucy Baines Johnson, daughter of Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson, and Dr. Bernard Lefke, retired Major General of the United States Army and a Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Purple Heart recipient.
The archive of this library contains thousands of letters to our 36th president, many of which concern the Vietnam War. Here are 2 letters from soldiers stationed in Vietnam during the height of President Johnson's tenure in office, which reflect the dramatically contrasting views of the war held by Americans, including our troops. Dear Mr. President, here's a picture of a little Vietnamese girl and myself. She has 3 older sisters, 2 older brothers, and a younger brother. They live in a village about 8 miles southeast of Da Nang. Their mother was killed by the VC. Because of us, she is able to smile. It is our duty to keep that smile, which portrays so much on her face. But there are many more who do not have the freedom smile which she has. It is our duty as Americans to bring happiness to those who may otherwise never be as free of care as she. To be able to pose with her and have her still look so happy gives the idea of the good we are doing here. This is worth fighting for. This is worth dying for. I know the weight you must carry on your shoulders, sir, and I pray that God will help you. I hope this letter and picture will bring you a blessing. She says the Marines are number 1. Sincerely yours, First Corporal Lee Vernon Bennett, U.S. Marine Corps. Dear Sir, I hope this letter finds the President in the best of health. Before I begin, allow me to introduce myself. I am PFC Nichols, United States Marines in Vietnam, and this is the topic of the letter. Like most of the servicemen fighting here, I don't fully understand this war. We're given training, long talks, and finally a weapon, and told we have a war to fight so that the people of Vietnam can have a communist-free government. In short, sir, we're fighting this war for the Vietnamese people, and I'd like to know why. Why should my buddies and other people's sons have to die fighting for what he doesn't understand or believe in? I've been here for 7 months and probably will be here until my 13 is completed if all goes well, but never will be able to understand why are these Americans and maybe myself must die for people who really don't seem to give a damn. Most of us are hoping one day to see our loved ones, and to me this seems the most important to most of us. And if you were to ask the question, what are we fighting for? The honest men would tell you to get through these 13 months to get back home. I hope you can understand our feelings and answer our questions in this letter. Thank you, sir, for your time. The time you've taken to read this letter. Yours truly, PFC Charles E. Nichols, United States Marine Corps.
I'm going to read 2 letters from my husband, who also was a Marine in Vietnam. And we got married in December in Washington, and he left in March. And he came home on our daughter's 6-month birthday. This is May 31st, 1968. My darling Linda, today I was a very lucky man. About 11 o'clock this morning, I was back at the bunker, the battalion CP, and walking toward the command bunker when I heard the familiar sound of incoming mortars. Even before the first round hit, I yelled, "Incoming!" and dived for the nearest hole, just as the first round landed about 20 meters away. Within 10 seconds, other Marines had dived into the very same hole on top of me, which was only big enough for 2 people to begin with. Rounds continued to land all around us for the next minute or so. Then there was a pause of about 30 seconds, and one last round landed right on the opposite edge of the foxhole. Fortunately, all the shrapnel went forward in the same direction the round was headed, and none of it came back into the foxhole. As it was, that one round, which completely destroyed the 2 company office structures next to my office and killed a small dog, which was not smart enough to get into a hole when the incoming started. My office structure was only slightly damaged, and the only Marine casualties from that last round were the 2 mild concussions suffered by 2 men who piled in on top of me. Had the round landed just 6 inches shorter, all of us would have been killed. Needless to say, we all felt very lucky, even though there were a few others in the general area who did not fare so well. Often Chuck's company provided security for the road sweeps and the convoys to the outposts near the Cambodian border. And this is an August 5th, 1968 letter. I usually outpost the road all the way out and then pick up the troops on tanks and Amtraks on the way back. Otherwise, the round trip would take over a day each way. We were a little past the halfway point when one of the Amtrucks was blown up by what we later discovered was a command-detonated 35-pound box mine. Command detonated means it was set off by a person hiding some distance away with a fuse box instead of a regular pressure or pressure relief mechanism. It was immediately engulfed in flames as the mine ignited at least 6 of the Amtrak's 12 gas tanks. I had 1 entire platoon on the vehicle at the time, in addition to a 3-man forward air control team and a 4-man Amtrak crew. The net result was 30 casualties, many from shrapnel, but all from burns. Just yesterday, I had received a fairly large number of replacements and had assigned over half of them to this platoon to make up for previous losses. Now they're back down to almost nothing again. For tomorrow's convoy, I've already made arrangements to borrow a platoon from another company. Someone is watching over me personally because I was on the Amtrak right behind the one the enemy decided to blow up and would have been just as good a target. Fortunately, the enemy didn't launch a ground attack to go with it. I was very proud of the company again. When the chips are down, they're tremendous.
This is a letter written to President Johnson by a captain of the Republic of Vietnam Army, written from a U.S. training base in Alabama on America's 190th birthday, July 4th, 1966. 4th of July, 1966. The Honorable Lyndon B. Johnson, President of the United States, the White House. Dear Mr. President, I'm Captain Nguyen Thọ Dang of Vietnam, now under training at the U.S. Army Chemical School and Center at Fort McClellan, Alabama. I am indebted and grateful to you for your recently thoughtfulness speeches, which made me read over and over again U.S. history and its Declaration of Independence. Again, I found your speeches the spirit of liberty which made America strong and free. I am confident with the generous aids and encouragement of your heroic nation, we shall finally emerge victorious in the struggle for freedom and independence. Enclosed is a study I have tried to write in English for the first time. I am taking the liberty to bring to your attention as a token of my appreciation. I sincerely hope that it may express to you our burning desire to fight for freedom, that almost it may serve as a self-explanation of a humble but grateful people who truthfully show his weakness to a true friend in order to be helped more effectively. With my very best wishes and respect to you, the leader of the free world, and to your honorable family. May I congratulate you, Mr. President, on the occasion of your Independence Day. Thank you.
When Patrick Nugent and I met the summer of 1965, he was graduating from college and already a member of the Air National Guard. We married a year later with a dream reception in the White House. Our first child was 9 months old in April of 1968 when Patrick volunteered for Vietnam. Patrick did not have to go to war. He went because he wanted to serve his country. Like many wives of servicemen, I frequently went home to my parents. Lying in my bed in the White House, I often heard the picketers say, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many boys did you kill today?" I lived in the terror of knowing my husband and brothers-in-law, Chuck Robb and Jerry Nugent, might be one of those boys. For my father, it was all so very personal. 3 of our troops in Vietnam were family. All felt like it. It was Daddy's constant struggle to bring them home safely and our country to the peace table. In January of 1969, Patrick wrote his father-in-law and Commander-in-Chief a letter. My father shared it with me because he was so proud of Patrick and grateful to him. His children and I remain so forever. 12 January. My dear Mr. President, Chuck and I had a very peaceful and eventful Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in Da Nang. The highlight of our Yuletide season was a telephone call from you, Mrs. Johnson, Lucy, and Linda. Lynn made a strong effort to converse with his daddy, but the conversation was one-sided, all on his side. Someday I looked for him to be president. of AT&T, that is. Christmas Day, Chuck and I made 3 stops to distribute the articles he had gathered. Our first stop was a small village some 30 miles southwest of Da Nang, where he passed out food and toys to the villagers. We then went to the Catholic orphanage in Da Nang and handed out all sorts of toys to the children. Our final stop of the day was the Naval Hospital in Da Nang, where we visited with the patients in the orthopedic ward. We also handed out writing materials and fruitcake. Christmas 1968 will always be a memorable one for 2 reasons. Number 1, it was my first Christmas away from my family, and I hope the last. And 2, I was able to help other people appreciate the meaning of Christmas. The war activity has increased somewhat since the beginning of the new year. Everyone is half expecting some sort of offensive around Tet. The hot areas are still located northwest of Saigon, along the Cambodian border. 10 days ago, my aircraft came under mortar fire at Khartoum as we were coming to a halt on the runway. As usual, I didn't realize that we were being fired upon. My primary concern was to offload the 56 GIs I had on board. Thank God, no one was hit, and the aircraft never received a scratch. The number of days I have remaining in Vietnam is diminishing quite rapidly, or as the GIs refer to it, I'm getting short. As of this writing, I have 88 days remaining. I received my orders last week, which in effect state I am to report to Bergstrom Air Force Base for separation from active duty upon return stateside. This letter will be my last, addressed to you as my Commander-in-Chief. I consider it both an honor and a privilege to have served under your command and direction. I didn't want to see you vacate the presidency, since you are the best we have. But at the same time, I respect your decision, and I am extremely proud of you. Our men in Vietnam know that you have done everything in your power to bring about a peaceful solution to the war. Unfortunately, we cannot negotiate with ourselves, nor it is our desire to abandon the hope of a free and democratic South Vietnam. You and Mrs. Johnson are in my prayers and thoughts today and every day. Love, Pat. P.S. I enjoyed talking to everyone last night. Thank you.
And tonight, it is indeed a tremendous honor for me to speak to you as we come together to honor our Vietnam veterans, and particularly those brave men and women who sacrificed their lives fighting for freedom and democracy in Vietnam. Each year around this time on April 30th, Vietnamese American communities commemorate and honor the fallen soldiers. We also remember and mourn the loss of millions of lives in Vietnam who died seeking freedom. Today, on behalf of the Vietnamese American community, I would like to express my deepest gratitude for the sacrifices made by America during the Vietnam War. 58,000 brave American soldiers and their families made the ultimate sacrifice, which allowed Vietnamese American communities to survive and migrate to this great country. 50 years ago, South Vietnam stood as a fortress of freedom and democracy safeguarding against the expansion of communism in Indochina. In making the stand against communism, 58,000 Americans together with 250,000 South Vietnamese lost their lives. North Vietnam's rallying cause was to prevent foreign occupation and ensure independent integrity, and over 450,000 North Vietnamese soldiers died in the fight for that cause. Today, what can we say was achieved these great losses? While the communist states around the world have already fallen, Vietnam still remains a communist state. North Vietnam's primary objective of preventing foreign occupation has now turned Vietnam into a Chinese vassal state. Vietnam today still has neither freedom nor democracy. What has transpired in the 41 years since the war ended does not change the gratitude we have for the brave men and women of the Vietnam War as we honor them today. I mention these facts because to properly honor those heroes, we must examine what their sacrifice means to us today and how much the cause for which they died still remains to be achieved. One day, when Vietnam is no longer under the communist control and is once a land of freedom and democracy, the Vietnam War will no longer be a reminder of division. Instead, it will be a reminder of a high price that freedom requires in all great countries. On that day, I believe that we will have finally truly honored these fallen soldiers, and the souls of those brave men and women will be proud that their sacrifice secured the most important blessing for mankind, freedom.
Why am I here today? I'm here today because a young man saved my life and changed my life. In 4 years of combat, there were many soldiers who did this for many of us. The name is Larry Morford. He was 24 when he was killed, 15 days before coming home. This man was in a battalion I commanded in 69-70. In that area, if you could remember, it was the height of the anti-Vietnam War. Larry was a fervent Christian, yet he was one of the very few who volunteered. In the battalion I had, over 90% were draftees. He was one of the very few volunteers. One day I asked Larry, why, if you're such a Christian, are you here? I know you don't believe in combat as the way to resolve conflict. And I know that you don't believe we should be in Vietnam. Why are you here? His answer was simple. Sir, I could not stay home when others were fighting this war. Sir, also, the job that you and I are doing is the job of a beast, and the least beastly of us should be doing it. That was Sergeant Morford's message. He lived his sermon. He's the man that has inspired me to create an award every year at West Point, the Sergeant Morford Award, that sends West Point cadets to China also to teach preventive medicine in Chinese high school. He, along with a corporal by the name of Lei Feng, who was killed at age 24, are two soldiers that are remembered in China. We're trying to make soldiers be role models of what a good citizen should be. As Cardinal Spellman mentioned, a religious leader in the United States, he said it this way: if I had not been a priest, I most certainly would have been a soldier, because they're both called to do the same thing. protect the innocent, and right the injustice. I listened to Mark, our host, and he has given me a very strict rule. And I must tell you that I left the Army and went to medical school and became a missionary in Africa. And in Africa, the rule is very simple. You can only speak as long as you have one leg up. When you can no longer keep that leg up, you must give up the podium or the audience can spear you. So let me end it by saying that it's only fitting that my remembrance of Sergeant Larry Morford should be followed by Sergeant Henry Kissinger. Because many of you probably don't know that before Dr. Kissinger became famous, he was a sergeant in the U.S. Army. May your parachutes open.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Larry Temple, Chairman of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Foundation.
Good evening. As chairman of the LBJ Foundation, it is my privilege to welcome you to this keynote presentation of the Vietnam War Summit. Lyndon Johnson would have been very proud of this summit and would have wanted it to take place. He would particularly have been proud that the valor and commitment of the men and women who served this country in Vietnam is being recognized and honored here. While few people seek disagreement and dispute, Lyndon Johnson never shied away from controversy. When this library was dedicated, LBJ famously proclaimed, "It's all here, the story of our time, with the bark off. There is no record of a mistake or of an unpleasantness or a criticism that is not included in the files here." The exhibits and papers in this library certainly testify to the remarkable accomplishments of LBJ's legacy. His monumental successes in civil rights were chronicled in the summit programs held in this library just 2 years ago. But this library does not ignore LBJ's anguish, the tragedy of the Vietnam War. His greatest disappointment was the failure to achieve peace in the war in Vietnam that he inherited and pursued. President Johnson always wanted this stage to be the forum for the great issues of the day. That includes reflections and revisiting of events of an earlier period to learn lessons to apply to the current time. So that is why I can say with certainty that President Johnson would welcome the discussions of this summit, including criticisms of decisions and actions that were taken 50 years ago. To borrow President Johnson's own words, the aspirations of this summit is to revisit the entire story of Vietnam with the bark off. There should be no record of a mistake or an unpleasantness or a criticism that is not included in this forum. Now it is my pleasure to introduce LBJ Foundation Chairman Emeritus Tom Johnson, who will present the program tonight.
Thank you, Larry. It is my honor and my privilege now to introduce my friend, Dr. Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger and I have known each other since 1967, when he was a relatively young professor at Harvard University, and I was a very low-ranking member of President Johnson's White House staff. In July 1967, Dr. Kissinger was a top secret channel for President Johnson through French intermediaries with North Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Van Dong and the aging Ho Chi Minh.